On a typical morning, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft glow over the city's quiet streets. Two police officers were on their usual patrol, checking for anything unusual as they drove through the neighborhoods. The hum of the car's engine was the only sound that broke the stillness of the morning, a routine that had become second nature to them over the years. As they cruised down a main road, something caught their attention. A sleek black car, moving a bit too fast for the speed limit, sped past them. It wasn't unusual for drivers to push the limits, but this car stood out. Without a second thought, the officers flicked on the sirens and pulled the car over to the side of the road. The woman driving the car did what anyone would do when they were pulled over. She slowed down and pulled to the curb. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about her at first glance. She was dressed simply, her posture relaxed as she stopped, and she didn't seem alarmed or overly nervous. It was just another routine traffic stop for the officers. As the officers got out of their car and approached, they had no idea what was about to unfold. They had done countless traffic stops in their careers, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the woman was sitting calmly behind the wheel, her face showing no signs of stress. Maybe it was her confident demeanor. There was something about her that gave off a quiet sense of authority, but the officers didn't think much of it at the time. They walked toward her car, the standard procedure running through their minds. One officer reached the window and gave a polite knock, signaling for the woman to roll it down. She did so without hesitation, her movements smooth and composed. As soon as the window was down, the officer leaned in and greeted her, starting with the usual questions about her speed and asking for her license and registration. The woman handed over her documents without fuss, and the officer took a moment to glance at them. His eyes briefly scanned her name, her address, and the other details. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He didn't recognize her name, but that didn't mean much. People often drove unfamiliar cars, and they didn't always know the names of everyone they interacted with. However, as the officer stood there, something in the back of his mind kept nagging at him. There was something about her that felt oddly familiar, something he couldn't place. He scanned her face again, trying to match it to someone he might know. Her face was calm, almost like she was waiting for something more than just a simple traffic stop. For a split second, the officer's thoughts began to race, trying to figure out where he had seen her before. Had he met her at a community event? Had she been involved in any local news stories? He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew she wasn't just any random driver. As the silence stretched on, the woman seemed to sense his unease. There was a brief pause before she finally spoke, breaking the quiet tension that had started to settle. She gave him a slight smile, not unkind, but knowing. It was as if she had already anticipated the moment that the officer would begin to piece things together. And then, with calm precision, she said, "I assume you're wondering why this might be a bit awkward." The officer blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure where she was going with this, but the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew stronger. His partner, standing nearby, glanced over, clearly unsure of what was happening. The woman's voice, smooth and assured, continued. "I'm the new head of your division," she said, her words landing like a bombshell. The officer froze, his mind suddenly racing. He had no idea that the woman he had just stopped was someone so important, someone with a leadership role that could affect his career and the future of the department. This wasn't just a regular driver. This was his new boss, the person who would soon be in charge of him and his colleagues. It took a few moments for the weight of her words to sink in. His stomach twisted as the realization hit. He had just pulled over the person who was now in charge of their entire division. A moment that was supposed to be routine had turned into something far more significant, and neither officer had been prepared for it. The woman didn't wait for a reaction. She had already anticipated the shock that would follow. She simply sat there, still calm, waiting for them to process the news. The officers, still stunned, glanced at each other, unsure of how to proceed next. Their training had prepared them for many situations, but not for this one. It wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. The woman they had stopped was no stranger. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her calm, poised demeanor was a reminder of the power she now held over them. The officers stood there, unsure of what to do next. The revelation that the woman they had just pulled over was now the head of their division was still sinking in. Their minds were racing, but the only thing they could focus on was the calm look on her face. She wasn't angry, upset, or even irritated. Just a quiet confidence radiated from her. The officer holding her documents tried to regain his composure. His thoughts were jumbled, but he knew he needed to say something. He cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the papers in his hand, and glanced nervously at his partner, who was just as stunned as he was. It wasn't every day that you found out you were interacting with a person who would soon be in charge of your department. After a long pause, the officer spoke, his voice a little shaky. I'm sorry, ma'am. We didn't recognize you. This was supposed to be just a routine stop, but we had no idea. He felt the awkwardness creeping in, but he didn't want to say the wrong thing, especially now that he knew who she was. He quickly added, "We'll handle this differently, of course." The woman nodded, her expression unchanged. She wasn't upset by their surprise, even though they had clearly made a mistake by not recognizing her. "I understand," she said simply, her voice steady. There was no trace of hostility in her words. She wasn't there to make them feel guilty, but rather to make them realize something important. She didn't seem angry about being pulled over. If anything, she seemed almost calm in a way that was unsettling to the officers. For most people, being stopped by the police was a stressful event, even if they knew they hadn't done anything wrong. But this woman seemed unaffected. She wasn't flustered or annoyed, which only made the officers more aware of their own discomfort. The officer holding the paperwork fumbled for a moment, unsure whether to apologize again or continue with the stop. But the woman spoke before he could say anything. "Look, I get it," she said. "This is a routine part of your job. But the truth is, this could have gone a lot differently." The words caught the officers off guard. She wasn't threatening them, but there was a quiet authority in her voice that made them realize just how much she understood about the challenges they faced. She wasn't just the new head of their division. She was someone who had been in their shoes before. She knew how stressful things could get and how easy it was to fall into routine. "I'm not angry with you," she continued, "but I do think it's important for you both to realize that things might not always be so simple in the future." Her eyes met theirs, and they could see that she wasn't speaking just to make a point. She was trying to offer them something more, something they hadn't expected from this encounter. The officers were still processing her words when she added, "You can learn a lot from these small moments, whether you realize it or not. Sometimes, the people you pull over aren't just drivers. They're part of something bigger. They could be your future colleagues, or in this case, your boss." Her words lingered in the air between them. The officers exchanged glances, but neither of them knew how to respond. It was an odd situation, one that left them feeling a little humbled. This wasn't just another person they had stopped. This was someone who could change the way they worked, the way they viewed their jobs. She didn't wait for them to apologize again. Instead, she gave them both a small, reassuring smile, one that hinted she understood how this might feel for them. It wasn't easy to go from seeing someone as just a regular citizen to realizing they were someone in charge of the very department you worked for. There was a shift in the way the officers saw her now, not just as a person in power, but as a figure they would have to answer to. "I know it's a bit much to process," she said, breaking the silence. "But don't worry. We'll have plenty of time to get to know each other." With that, she returned her attention to the officer who had pulled her over. "You're doing your job, and that's what matters. Just remember, your actions reflect who you are as a person, no matter who you're dealing with. Keep that in mind." The officers nodded, still a little stunned by her calm wisdom. They couldn't help but wonder how their interactions with her would change in the future. They knew they were facing a new era under her leadership, but what exactly that would look like, they still weren't sure. As the encounter ended and the woman pulled away, the officers stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. They couldn't shake the feeling that their simple traffic stop had somehow opened their eyes to something bigger than themselves. The moment the woman revealed who she was, the atmosphere around the officers shifted. They stood there, still processing her words. The quiet, confident way she had said she was the new head of their division seemed to hang in the air, almost as if it were too big to comprehend all at once. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to proceed now that they knew who she was. The woman didn't seem to mind the silence. She didn't rush them to speak, allowing them the space to gather their thoughts. She could tell they were stunned, but she also understood that this kind of realization was going to take a moment to settle in. It wasn't every day that you realized the person you had just pulled over was now in charge of your department. After a few seconds, one of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We really didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "We just didn't recognize you, ma'am. This is a little awkward." The woman smiled softly at his discomfort. She could tell he was nervous, but she didn't seem upset. "I understand," she said. "It's not every day you find out that the person you stopped is the one who'll be running things around here. But don't worry, there's no need to feel bad about it." Her words helped ease the tension, though it didn't completely go away. The officers were still processing everything. They had worked with many different people over the years. Officers they respected, others they didn't. But this felt different. She wasn't just a boss to them now. She was someone they had to answer to, someone who had the power to change the way things were done. And that realization made them nervous. The woman took a deep breath and decided to break the tension a little further. "You know, it's not a big deal that you didn't recognize me right away. But it's a reminder of how important it is to pay attention, to know who's around you. I'm sure you've pulled over plenty of people without realizing who they really are." Her voice was calm and measured, but there was an edge to it that made the officers take her words seriously. She wasn't just talking about recognizing faces. She was talking about being mindful of every interaction. About the idea that any small moment could have bigger consequences than you realized. The officer who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, clearly reflecting on what she was saying. "Yeah, you're right," he admitted. "Sometimes it's easy to just go through the motions without thinking about who we're interacting with. It's easy to forget that everyone has a story, or maybe even something important going on in their lives." The woman's eyes softened at his honesty. She could tell he wasn't just saying it to be polite. It was clear he had some genuine self-awareness. "Exactly," she said, "and that's something I want all of us to remember. Not just when we're out on patrol, but every day in the work we do. Every person we meet is a person, not just a number or a case file." The officers stood in silence for a moment, each of them reflecting on her words. The traffic stop, which had begun like so many others, had turned into something far deeper. They hadn't expected this conversation to go in this direction. They had thought it would be like any other stop, but now they realized that there was much more at stake. Their actions weren't just about catching someone speeding or handing out a ticket. They were about treating people with respect, even in the smallest moments. The woman glanced at her watch, realizing it was time for her to move on. "I think we're done here," she said, her tone light but firm. "But remember what we talked about today. It's going to be important, not just for you, but for the entire department." The officers nodded, still processing everything. The tension had started to lift, but the weight of the conversation had stayed with them. As she began to walk back to her car, one of the officers called out to her. "Thank you," he said, a genuine note of appreciation in his voice. "We'll definitely keep what you said in mind." The woman turned and smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "I'm sure you will," she replied. "We all have a lot to learn, but that's how we grow." With that, she got into her car, and the officers watched as she drove off. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather thoughtful. They knew that the encounter they had just had wasn't something that happened every day. It was a reminder to them that their actions, no matter how small, had meaning. As the officers got back into their patrol car, they both sat for a moment, reflecting on the conversation. They realized that this wasn't just about meeting the new head of their division. It was about understanding what it meant to be a part of something bigger. It was about being more mindful of how they treated people, not just as officers, but as human beings. After the traffic stop, things felt different for the officers. As they drove through the streets, their usual patrol routine no longer seemed so ordinary. They were still reflecting on their interaction with the woman, the new head of their division. Her words were echoing in their minds, reminding them that every encounter was more than just another task to check off. There was a bigger picture they needed to consider. The officers couldn't stop thinking about the way she carried herself. The calm confidence she has shown, even in the face of being pulled over by her own officers, had been striking. Most people in that situation would have been defensive or uncomfortable. But she had been completely composed, almost as if she had expected this moment to happen. The officers couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for her poise. It wasn't something they saw every day, especially not in the high-pressure world of law enforcement. As they continued with their patrol, the officers began to realize that they needed to change how they approached their jobs. They had always prided themselves on doing things by the book, following the rules, and making sure they did everything right. But after meeting the woman, they understood that there was more to being a good officer than just checking off boxes. It was about making sure that every action they took, every person they interacted with, was treated with care and respect. The traffic stop had shown them that their jobs were about more than enforcing the law. It was about building trust, treating people fairly, and always being aware of the impact they had on others. They had been so focused on their duties that they hadn't really stopped to think about how they could make a positive difference in someone's day. The woman had reminded them that small moments, like pulling someone over for speeding, could have a lasting impact, not just on the person being stopped, but on everyone involved. Later that day, when they were back at the station, the officers couldn't stop talking about what had happened. They found themselves discussing her calm demeanor, her words about paying attention to who people really were, and how important it was to look beyond the surface. They realized that they had been missing something. For all their years on the force, they had never really thought about how much they could learn from every person they interacted with. They hadn't been mindful enough, and that was something they were now determined to change. The woman's visit had shaken them, in a good way. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that the way they saw the world and the people in it needed to shift. Instead of approaching every situation with a mindset of control, they needed to be more open, more understanding. They needed to listen more carefully, not just to the words people spoke, but to the silent cues that revealed who they really were. One of the officers, who had been particularly struck by the encounter, suggested that they make a habit of reflecting on their interactions more often. "Maybe we should start thinking about how each stop could be an opportunity to make a difference," he said. "Not just doing our job, but doing it in a way that leaves a positive impact on people." His partner agreed, adding, "Yeah, I think we've been so focused on the rules, on doing things a certain way, that we forgot the most important thing, treating people like they matter." Both officers knew they had a lot to learn. They didn't expect things to change overnight, but they were committed to trying. They realized that their jobs weren't just about protecting the law, but about protecting their communities too, about understanding the people they served and working with them to create a safer, more trusting environment. As the days went by, the officers found themselves putting the lessons they had learned from the woman into practice. They started taking extra care to be more mindful of their tone when speaking to people, making sure they weren't rushing through interactions. They paid closer attention to the people they encountered, noticing the little things that told a bigger story about who they were. It wasn't always easy, and they made mistakes along the way. But with each day, they got better. They realized that the real value of their job wasn't just in issuing tickets or making arrests. It was in building relationships, earning trust, and helping people feel heard and respected. And that, they learned, was how they could truly make a difference. The woman's simple yet powerful message had changed the way they looked at their work. She had shown them that the real power in law enforcement didn't come from enforcing rules alone. It came from understanding people, from seeing them as more than just cases or suspects, but as human beings who deserved dignity and respect. The officers continued to carry the lessons they had learned from that surprising encounter with the woman, now the head of their division. It had changed their perspective, and as the days went on, they began noticing how much of an impact it was having on their work. Their interactions with the public felt different, less like routine tasks and more like meaningful exchanges. They realized that every moment they spent with a citizen, whether in a routine traffic stop or just a casual conversation, was an opportunity to show respect and understanding. They found themselves talking about the encounter more than they expected. The quiet confidence the woman had shown that day seemed to stay with them, like a guide to how they could do their jobs better. Each day, they tried to put what they had learned into action. It wasn't easy, though. Old habits were hard to break, and sometimes it felt like the pressure of the job was too much to focus on anything beyond the basics. But they didn't want to forget what they had learned. One afternoon, the officers found themselves in another situation where they could put their new mindset to the test. They were called to a scene where a car had been involved in a minor accident. The driver was shaken up, but physically unharmed. As they approached the vehicle, the officers instinctively started checking for injuries and assessing the situation. But this time, something was different. As they spoke to the driver, they noticed how nervous she was, her hands trembling as she held the steering wheel. Instead of rushing to get the information they needed, the officers paused. One of them, remembering the lesson from their earlier encounter, softened his approach. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll make sure you're all right. Just take a deep breath." The woman looked at him, a bit surprised at the gentle tone. "I'm just a little shaken," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I wasn't expecting this to happen. It's been a tough week." The officer nodded. "I get it," he said. "Accidents are never easy, and sometimes things feel like they're piling up. We'll take care of everything here. No rush." His partner stood nearby, watching the exchange, and saw how much of a difference this shift in approach made. The woman, who had been anxious and on edge, began to relax a little. She still had concerns, but the officer's kind words helped ease her nerves. For the first time in a long time, the officer felt like he wasn't just handling a situation. He was connecting with a person, and that connection mattered. As the scene was wrapped up and the paperwork began, the officers looked at each other and exchanged a silent understanding. They had handled this situation differently, and it felt right. It wasn't about checking off a list of duties. It was about making sure the person they were interacting with felt heard, respected, and understood. They weren't just there to enforce rules. They were there to help people through difficult moments. The officers couldn't help but think back to the woman who had given them the lesson they were now practicing. Her words had opened their eyes to the importance of empathy in their work. They were learning that, at the end of the day, their job wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about people. The more they learned about themselves, the better they became at understanding others. And that was something that made all the difference. As the days went by, the officers began to notice that their approach was having an effect on the people they interacted with. More often than before, they saw people responding differently, calming down faster, feeling less defensive, and even thanking them for their patience. The officers weren't trying to be soft or lenient. They were simply treating people like they mattered, like their concerns were valid. This wasn't just about being kind for the sake of being kind. It was about realizing that how you treated people could change the outcome of a situation. The officers had seen it firsthand. When they took the time to listen, to acknowledge the stress or fear someone was experiencing, it made the whole process easier for both them and the person they were interacting with. It was still a learning curve, and the officers knew they had a long way to go, but they were proud of the progress they had made. The woman who had been so calm and composed had shown them the power of understanding and compassion, and it was something they were now carrying with them every day. Every interaction was now an opportunity to practice this new way of thinking. They were no longer just following procedures. They were creating a space for connection where the people they met felt like they weren't just another case, but a person. It was small moments like these that were changing the way they worked, and they knew that these changes would make a bigger impact than they could have imagined. As the weeks passed, the officers continued to apply what they had learned from their encounter with the new head of their division. The lessons about patience, empathy, and truly seeing the people they interacted with began to shape the way they approached their work. They were still learning, still adjusting, but they felt a sense of pride in how far they had come. Their shifts felt different now, not just because of their newfound perspective, but because they were starting to see results. One evening, they responded to a call about a man who was acting erratically near a busy street. When they arrived, they found him pacing back and forth, talking to himself and appearing visibly distressed. At first, the officers thought it might be a simple case of someone having a bad day, but something about the way that the man was acting told them it was more serious. He didn't seem to be aware of his surroundings, and cars were speeding by just inches away from him. The officers exchanged a glance, knowing they needed to handle this carefully. In the past, their first instinct would have been to approach the situation with authority, getting the man off the street, controlling the situation quickly. But now, with the lessons from the head of their division still fresh in their minds, they realized they needed to take a different approach. One of the officers stepped forward slowly, making sure to keep a calm, steady presence. "Hey there," he called out softly. "I can see you're having a tough time. We're here to help you. Can you tell me what's going on?" The man paused for a moment, still twitching nervously but looking up at the officer. For a brief moment, the officer saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was clear that the man was struggling, but the officer's gentle tone seemed to break through his confusion, if only for a second. Can't breathe," the man muttered, his voice shaky. "It's all too much to handle." The officer nodded, not rushing to judge or react. "I hear you," he said calmly. "It sounds like you're really overwhelmed right now. I'm here to help, okay? Let's take a slow breath together. You're not alone in this." The officer's partner stood back, watching carefully but staying quiet, letting his colleague take the lead. They both knew the most important thing right now was to make the man feel heard, not to force him into a solution right away. The officer who had spoken first crouched down slightly to meet the man's eyes at his level. "You don't have to talk about everything right now," he said. "Just take it one step at a time. We can walk through this together. You're safe with us." Gradually, the man began to calm down. His breathing slowed, and the panic in his eyes softened. He didn't immediately start sharing all the details of what had been bothering him, but he seemed to understand that the officers weren't there to arrest him or make the situation worse. They weren't just reacting to a problem. They were responding to a person who needed help. After a few moments of quiet, the man nodded. I don't know where to turn anymore," he whispered. "Everything feels like it's collapsing." The officer continued speaking softly, not interrupting or offering too much advice. He understood that sometimes people just needed someone to listen. They didn't always need solutions right away. Sometimes the first step was making sure the person felt heard, understood, and supported. Eventually, the officers were able to guide the man away from the busy street and into a nearby safe area. They called for medical assistance, ensuring that he would get the help he needed. They didn't hurry through the process, but instead, they stayed with him, making sure he felt comfortable and secure. They didn't treat him like a case. They treated him like a person, and it made all the difference. As the situation was resolved and the man was taken into care, the officers shared a quiet moment of reflection. They realized that what had felt like a simple call had turned into something much more meaningful. By slowing down, by really listening, they had helped the man in a way that went beyond their usual duties. It wasn't just about getting him off the street. It was about understanding his needs, even when he couldn't express them clearly himself. Later that night, as they drove back to the station, one of the officers spoke up. "You know," he said, "I think we handled that a lot differently than we would have before. It wasn't just about rushing in and fixing the problem. We took the time to really listen to him, to connect with him. That's something I don't think we'd have done a few months ago." His partner nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's strange," he said. "I never realized how much we missed by just focusing on the job. But when you take a step back and just be present, you realize there's a lot more going on with people than you might see at first." The officers were beginning to see just how much their approach was changing not only their work, but the way they felt about it. Every day, they were putting what they had learned into practice, and the results were starting to show. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were connecting with people in ways they hadn't thought possible before. They were learning that their jobs weren't just about enforcing the law, but about understanding the people they served and making a positive impact in their communities. One morning, they were called to respond to a noise complaint at a local park. It seemed like a typical call at first, people making too much noise late at night. But when they arrived, they quickly realized that things weren't as simple as they had seemed. The park was full of people, not partying, but gathering for a community event. There were children playing, families having picnics, and groups of people talking and laughing together. The officers noticed that it wasn't just any random gathering. It was a group of people who had come together to support one of their own, a local resident who was going through a difficult time. As the officers walked through the park, they saw the sense of community in action. People were helping each other, offering food and comfort to someone who had recently lost a loved one. It was a moment of unity, a moment where everyone was there for each other. The officers knew they had to approach this situation carefully. They didn't want to disrupt something that was clearly a positive force in the community. One officer, remembering what they had learned from their previous encounters, spoke to a group of people who were gathered nearby. "Hey there," he said with a smile. "We got a call about the noise, but it looks like you all are having a gathering here. I just want to make sure everything's okay." The group looked at him, surprised at his calm and respectful tone. "We're just here to support our neighbor," one person explained. "They've been going through a tough time, and we wanted to come together and help them feel better. It's not a party, just a small get-together." The officer nodded, appreciating the explanation. "I understand. It's important to look out for each other, especially when someone's going through a rough patch," he said. "I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. We don't want to interrupt what you're doing, but we do need to keep the noise level down a little." The group agreed without hesitation, and the officer was surprised at how quickly they understood. They weren't defensive or upset. Instead, they were grateful that the officer had approached them with respect and understanding. It was a reminder that sometimes people weren't trying to break the rules, they were just trying to do something good. And when the officers approached them with kindness, the situation was resolved without any conflict. As they left the park, the officers couldn't help but talk about the experience. "That went a lot differently than I thought it would," one of them said. "We expected a lot of resistance, but they were so understanding. It's like they knew we were just doing our job, not trying to cause problems." The other officer agreed. "Yeah, and we handled it differently too. Instead of just jumping in with the rules, we actually listened to them. We got a chance to see what was really going on, and it made all the difference." That moment in the park was another reminder of how much things had changed. The officers realized that their job wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about being part of the community. They were there to protect, yes, but they were also there to understand and support the people they served. Over time, they started to notice a shift in how they were treated by the public. People seemed to be more open with them, more willing to talk and share what was going on in their lives. The officers had become familiar faces in their neighborhoods, not just as enforcers of the law, but as trusted members of the community. They were no longer just seen as figures of authority, but as individuals who cared about the well-being of others. One day, while on patrol, The officers stopped at a local coffee shop for a quick break. As they sat down with their drinks, a woman who recognized them approached the table. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, smiling. "You helped my son a few weeks ago when he was having some trouble. You didn't just give him a ticket. You actually talked to him and listened. It really meant a lot." The officers were taken aback by the gratitude. It was moments like this that reminded them why they had chosen this line of work. It wasn't about the uniforms or the badges. It was about the impact they could have on people's lives. The woman's words meant more than any recognition they could have gotten from a supervisor or a fellow officer. As time went on, the officers noticed even more changes in their approach to policing and their overall job satisfaction. What had started as a subtle shift in their attitudes had grown into something much bigger. They weren't just performing their duties anymore. They were actively building trust with the people they served. They were becoming part of the community in ways they hadn't expected. It was a gradual transformation, but one that felt incredibly rewarding. One day, they were assigned to patrol a neighborhood that had long been known for its crime rates. This area was often seen as a place where people kept their heads down and avoided interaction with the police. Tensions had run high in the past, with residents wary of officers and officers just as cautious about the people in the neighborhood. But this time, things felt different. As they walked down the familiar streets, the officers noticed a change in the air. People seemed less guarded, more willing to acknowledge their presence with nods or smiles. They stopped to talk with a few residents, something they might have avoided before. One of the officers asked a group of people gathered outside a local store, "How's everything going in the neighborhood?" "We're just checking in to make sure everything's all right." The group, surprised but not suspicious, looked at each other before one man stepped forward. "You're not here to just give us tickets or mess with us?" he asked, his voice cautious but not hostile. The officer shook his head with a reassuring smile. "No, we're not here to cause trouble. We're just here to talk, make sure everyone's doing okay. We know things haven't always been easy around here, and we want to change that. If there's anything you need or anything we can help with, just let us know." The man studied the officer for a moment, trying to decide whether to trust him. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Well, we've been dealing with some stuff around here. People fighting, kids getting into trouble, that sort of thing. But honestly, it's not as bad as it used to be." The officer's partner, who had been listening quietly, jumped in. "That's good to hear. It sounds like things are improving. If there's anything we can do to help keep things moving in the right direction, we're here for that." The group seemed to relax a little more, and soon they were talking openly about the challenges they faced in the neighborhood. There was still a sense of distrust between the officers and the community, but this conversation was a start. The officers had learned that by showing up, not as authority figures, but as people who genuinely cared, they could make a real difference. As they continued their patrol, they encountered more people who, like the group outside the store, were willing to speak with them. People who had once avoided officers were now taking the time to talk, to share their concerns, and even ask for help with minor issues. It was a change that wasn't immediate, but it was clear that something had shifted in the way the community viewed them. That evening, as they reflected on the day, one of the officers remarked, "It's amazing how much things are changing. It used to be that people wouldn't even look at us when we walked by. Now, they're stopping to talk to us, asking questions, even sharing what's going on in their lives." His partner nodded, feeling the same sense of accomplishment. It's not about what we're doing differently. It's about how we're showing up. We're just here to help, to listen, to be a part of the neighborhood, not to control it. And I think people are starting to see that. They knew they still had a long way to go. Trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. But the officers were beginning to understand that it wasn't just about solving problems or enforcing laws. It was about creating an environment where people felt comfortable reaching out for help, knowing they wouldn't be judged or treated unfairly. As their patrol continued, the officers found themselves in situations that tested their patience and their commitment to their new approach. One night, they were called to a disturbance in a quiet part of the neighborhood. When they arrived, they found a couple arguing loudly on the sidewalk. The woman appeared upset, and the man was raising his voice, clearly agitated. In the past, the officers might have approached this with a sense of urgency, separating the individuals and immediately assessing who was at fault. But now, they took a step back. Instead of rushing to intervene, they gave the couple a moment to calm down. They stood nearby, speaking in calm voices, creating space for the situation to diffuse. The officers understood that by staying calm themselves, they could help the situation settle naturally. As the weeks went by, the officers started to realize just how much their approach had affected their work and their relationships with the community. They were not just officers on the streets anymore. They were becoming part of the fabric of the neighborhoods they served. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments where things didn't go as planned, but the shift in their mindset had begun to create lasting change. One day, they were called to a local school to help with a situation involving a group of teenagers who had been causing trouble in the area. The officers had heard about the teens in the past, and the reputation wasn't great. People often referred to them as troublemakers who had no respect for authority. The officers, however, knew that this was their chance to try a different approach. They didn't want to treat these kids like criminals. They wanted to understand what was going on and help them make better choices. When they arrived at the school, they were met by the principal, who explained the situation. The teens had been caught skipping class and hanging out in places they weren't supposed to be. The principal was concerned about their behavior, but was also looking for a way to address it without resorting to suspensions or police involvement. She didn't want to give up on them. She wanted to find a way to help them turn things around. The officers agreed to meet with a group of teens, and what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of immediately telling the teens what they had done wrong, one of the officers asked, "Why are you guys hanging out here instead of in class? What's going on?" The group was hesitant at first. They had been used to seeing officers as figures of authority who were only there to reprimand them. But the officer's tone was different, calm and understanding. Slowly, the teens started to open up. One boy admitted that he didn't like school because he didn't feel like he fit in, and another girl said that she was struggling with family issues that made it hard for her to concentrate on her work. They weren't bad kids. They just needed support. As the conversation continued, the officers didn't judge or lecture. They listened. They asked questions to better understand the teens' perspectives. They acknowledged the challenges the kids were facing and offered their support. One officer even shared a bit about his own experiences growing up, which helped the teens see him as more than just a uniform. By the end of the meeting, the officers and the teens had reached an understanding. The group agreed to attend their classes and stay out of trouble, and the officers promised to check in on them from time to time, not to punish them, but to offer help if they needed it. They didn't walk away with a win in the traditional sense. They didn't hand out any tickets or make arrests, but they knew they had made a real difference. They had connected with the teens on a human level and shown them that there was more to life than just getting into trouble. The officers couldn't help but think back to their earlier days on the force, when they might have handled this situation very differently. Back then, they might have focused solely on the law, on what the teens had done wrong and how to punish them. But now, they saw things differently. They understood that helping people meant understanding their struggles and working together to find solutions. It wasn't about punishment. It was about giving people the tools they needed to succeed. As time went on, their efforts continued to have a positive impact on the community. They started to see the effects of their new approach in more and more situations. People were beginning to trust them, and more importantly, they were starting to see officers as allies rather than authorities. The officers realized that their work was not just about solving problems. It was about building relationships. They had learned that when people felt heard and respected, they were more likely to cooperate and make positive changes in their lives. One day, after a particularly challenging shift, the officers sat down at their favorite diner for a cup of coffee. They talked about the changes they had seen, not just in the community, but in themselves. They knew that the work they were doing was hard, but it was also incredibly rewarding. They had learned that being a good officer wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about connecting with people, understanding their struggles, and helping them move forward.